Tonight's mystery involves a phrase that leads a double life, and if you look at the screen, it already looks like a ghost story. The phrase is cultural Marxism. And before we can understand why it shows up in memes and political speeches, we have to separate the two very different things people mean when they say it. Definition. One is the academic shorthand, a loose label some writers use for Marxist-influenced cultural analysis. Think arguments about media, education, art, and everyday life, not just wages and factories. For example, in April 1997, scholar Dennis Dworkin published Cultural Marxism in Post-War Britain, History, the New Left, and the Origins of Cultural Studies. It wasn't an accusation. It was an intellectual history. Then there is definition 2, the one you see online. In this version, cultural Marxism isn't a school of analysis, it's an allegation of a hidden campaign to reshape society. Even the Oxford English Dictionary flags this modern sense as used depreciatively, a label for a perceived agenda, not a neutral description of a research tradition. This isn't just an argument about words. On March 26, 2019, a UK Member of Parliament was publicly criticised after using the term, with opponents and community groups warning that it echoes anti-Semitic conspiracy tropes. And in February 2024, a Florida education proposal that talked about the threat of communism drew attention in part because one version used language like cultural Marxism, while a parallel Senate version dropped it. So how did we get here? How did a set of ideas from early 20th century German social theory end up as a catch-all villain in 21st century culture war talk? In this episode, we aren't here to call names. We're here to trace the receipts, what the Frankfurt School actually argued, and how, decades later, their work got repackaged into a modern ghost story. First, we need to establish the reality. Let's go back to 1923, to the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, and to thinkers who would later be driven into exile by fascism, not quietly steering pop culture from the shadows.
To understand the ghost, we should start with what it actually was: an office building, not a hidden temple.
This is the actual Frankfurt School. It looks remarkably normal.
It was. The Institute for Social Research was founded in 1923 in Frankfurt am Main, and it opened its first dedicated building in 1924. Not a bunker, an academic institute. By 1930, Max Horkheimer became director, and he pulled together the circle we now call the Frankfurt School. Thinkers like Theodor Adorno.
So they were just professors. What were they actually studying?
They were Marxist-influenced, but not the Soviet parade version. They were trying to explain a specific failure. Why didn't the working class in Germany make a socialist revolution? And why were so many people being drawn toward authoritarian politics instead?
That seems like a reasonable question for a German in the 1930s.
It was urgent. In 1933, Hitler took power, and the institute was shut down by the new regime. They didn't infiltrate. They fled, briefly through places like Geneva, and then re-established the institute in New York in 1934, affiliated with Columbia University.
So the Frankfurt School spent most of its famous years in America.
Yes, their most influential work was written in exile. In 1937, Horkheimer laid out the program in an essay titled Traditional and Critical Theory. This is where the Frankfurt School sharply defines what it means by critical theory. Not a demolition plan, an approach.
Analyzing it how?
Traditional theory, he says, tends to describe the world as it is. Critical theory asks how the world got that way, and who benefits from it staying that way. But their bleakest diagnosis comes next. Dialectic of Enlightenment. Drafts circulated in 1944. It was published in 1947.
This is the book that supposedly launched the attack on Western culture.
That's the accusation. But the book reads less like an attack and more like a lament. How the Enlightenment's promise of liberation can flip into new forms of domination. They argue that modern reason can become purely instrumental, cold calculation. So technology and bureaucracy don't free people, they manage them. And that brings us to their most misunderstood phrase, the culture industry.
Wait, I thought the conspiracy says they created the culture industry to brainwash us.
It's the opposite. They thought mass entertainment was already an industry, built to sell, standardize, and smooth over conflict. They could be brutally elitist about it. Adorno, in particular, wrote with real contempt about popular music, including jazz as he understood it, and about Hollywood.
So they were elitist snob.
Often, yes. They weren't trying to sneak secret messages into your movies. They were warning that the whole machine of mass culture nudges people toward passive consumption. Finally, Exhibit C. The year is 1950. The war is over. The authoritarian personality isn't a manifesto. It's a huge, data-heavy social psychology study, about 990 pages, produced by researchers at UC Berkeley, including Adorno.
That looks incredibly boring.
It is. It tries to measure why some people are drawn to fascist ideas. And it introduces the F scale as one tool to assess authoritarian tendencies. By 1950-1951, the institute itself was returning to Frankfurt and reopening there. Many of the key figures spent their later careers back in West Germany.
So, to summarize, a group of German professors fled the Nazis, wrote pessimistic books about modern society, and published nearly 1,000 pages of statistics.
Essentially, not spellbooks to summon a new age, diagnoses from people trying to understand how a civilized world slid into catastrophe. That is the reality. But in the 1990s, a very different story began to be told.
To find the cultural Marxism people mean today, we have to leave 1930s Germany. We jump to Washington, D.C. in the early 1990s. The Berlin Wall is gone. The Soviet Union has collapsed. But on American TV, a new fight is filling the screen. The culture war.
So, actual communism is dead. Why did anyone need a new Marxist conspiracy?
Because conservatives felt they were losing on a different front. The buzzword back then wasn't woke, it was political correctness. Campus speech fights, multicultural curricula, feminism. It felt like one big push, but it didn't have a single villain. It was just a vibe.
Until someone gave it a name.
Exactly. In 1992, a writer named Michael Minnicino published an essay called The New Dark Age, the Frankfurt School and Political Correctness. It ran in Fidelio, a magazine tied to the LaRouche movement, and it reframed the Frankfurt School not as theorists, but as plotters, people who supposedly engineered political correctness to unravel Judeo-Christian Western culture on purpose.
So he took the real philosophers we just met and cast them as Bond villains?
Pretty much. He backfilled the history. He drew a straight line from Adorno and Horkheimer to 1990s campus battles. And for a while, it stayed in that niche. Then, in the late 1990s, Paul Weyrich and the Free Congress Foundation started promoting the framework. Because it was a perfect political weapon. They put out a video called Political Correctness, the Frankfurt School, in 1999. It looks like a documentary, ominous tone, authoritative voice, tidy villains. And it centers William S. Lind, a conservative strategist, as the guide. In a widely circulated 2000 talk, Lind gives the punchline that makes the ghost stick. Political correctness isn't just a social trend, it's cultural Marxism. Marxism shifted from economics into culture. Once you buy that, PC stops being an argument you can debate. It becomes sabotage.
It's a powerful story. It takes a messy world, feminism, gay rights, secularism, and gives it a single cause. It's not social evolution, it's a plot.
Precisely. Totalizing blame. And this is where the corkboard logic gets dangerous. In 2003, the Southern Poverty Law Center described cultural Marxism as a conspiracy theory with an anti-Semitic twist, because it so often pins modern change on a small circle of mostly Jewish émigré intellectuals. Even when someone insists they don't mean it that way, the structure echoes older Jewish Bolshevism scapegoating.
So by the early 2000s, the weapon is forged. The cultural Marxism label is ready.
It was ready, and it was waiting for the perfect delivery system: the Internet.
We've seen how an older European smear about corrupting culture evolved into the modern internet phrase cultural Marxism. So why won't this ghost die? It isn't just politics, it's psychology. The phrase works like a compression algorithm for a messy world. Instead of arguing 10 complicated topics, immigration, gender, schools, media, you cram them into one box. And if you can name a villain, you can skip the hard parts. Second reason, control. When life feels unstable, a conspiracy story can feel, paradoxically, stabilizing. A longitudinal study highlighted in late 2024 found that unmet needs for control and belonging were among the strongest predictors of conspiracy belief. Exactly the missing pieces you see in the head and network graphic. It's not that people are crazy. It's that a clean story, even a scary one, feels less frightening than randomness. It promises someone is in charge. And once you accept the story, the term becomes a badge. It signals you're part of the group that sees what's really going on. A 2025 model of conspiracy engagement, described as moving from recognition to belief to action, suggests that simply recognizing the vocabulary can be a gateway step. Learn the code words, and the slide gets easier. Third reason it sticks. It's useful because it's vague. It's a shapeshifter. You can hear the same pattern with labels like woke. They become containers for whatever the listener already fears. Sociologists call this kind of symbolic villain a folk devil, a figure that helps unify the good people against a perceived threat. Cultural Marxism is especially sticky because it sounds academic. It gives a grievance the sheen of a syllabus. That's why the ghost persists, not as a precise claim, but as a tool, like that big red stamp on chaos, turning anxiety into an enemy you can name. Now that we know how the ghost survives, let's finish with why precision matters, and how to stop arguing with phantoms. So we're left with two distinct realities sharing one label. On one side, a small circle of Frankfurt School thinkers, academic critics, long gone. On the other, a modern political ghost story that blames cultural Marxism for everything from corporate training to modern art. And like that split screen we're looking at, you can feel the confusion. Scholarship on the left, algorithmic panic on the right. Usually, it's the ghost. Even the Oxford English Dictionary frames the term as something used depreciatively, especially in right-wing commentary, to describe an alleged agenda inside Western institutions. That ambiguity isn't just annoying, it breaks debate. If one person means academic critique, and another means a secret plot to destroy the West, you can't fact-check, because the claim keeps sliding between meanings. You can't argue with a ghost. We saw that play out in Florida in 2024. Florida lawmakers advanced a history of communism proposal that initially included the phrase cultural Marxism, then stripped the phrase out in amendments. Even in a state house, it was too politically loaded and too hard to define cleanly on the page. So here's the takeaway. Precision isn't just politeness, it's intellectual self-defense. When you hear the label, ask for the definition. Are we talking about Adorno's critique of the culture industry, or an allegation of a coordinated conspiracy? Make them show their work. Because the ghost is still active, The phrase keeps circulating, and even books analysing the conspiracy theory keep the file open. For example, Verso's The Cultural Marxism Conspiracy by A.J.A. Woods is scheduled for release on April 21st, 2026. History is messy enough on its own. We don't need invented puppet masters to explain it. I'm your host, and this has been The History of a Ghost.